When I first met Henry Miller, he was sitting quietly in the corner of my clinic waiting room, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor as though looking up might reveal something he wasn't ready to face. At 72, Henry carried the kind of presence that made you feel he had weathered many storms in life. A retired high school history teacher from a small town in Vermont, known by friends and family as the man who could recall every major event in the past 50 years with an uncanny accuracy. But that day, the usual spark in his eyes was missing. His daughter Emily had brought him in after she noticed something strange at breakfast a few days earlier. His right hand trembled as he reached for his coffee, and when she asked if he was all right, his words came out slightly slurred. The tremor faded quickly, and his speech returned to normal within minutes. But the image of her father struggling to form words had shaken her deeply. When Henry sat across from me in my office, he insisted it was nothing. "Probably just tired," he said with a faint smile, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He had been in good health for most of his life, priding himself on staying active, walking to the park every morning, and enjoying long afternoons in his garden. He never smoked, rarely drank, and believed he was doing everything right, especially when it came to nutrition. For years, he'd taken a carefully chosen array of supplements, convinced they were his shield against the illnesses that had claimed so many of his old friends. But as I listened to his story and looked at the list of vitamins he kept in his neat handwriting, a troubling pattern began to emerge, one I had seen too many times before. I asked Henry to tell me more about his daily routine, and he described it with the precision of a man who once stood in front of classrooms full of eager minds. Every morning at 6:30, he'd make himself a light breakfast, pour a glass of water, and take his morning lineup: a handful of capsules and tablets, vitamin D for bones, vitamin E for the heart, a B complex for energy, a vision supplement with vitamin A for the eyes, and a heart health formula with niacin. It was a regimen he had built slowly over the years, based on articles he'd read, advice from friends, and snippets from health magazines. He believed he was fortifying his body, but in reality, he was unknowingly building a dangerous cocktail that could tip the balance inside his brain in the most devastating way. The morning of his episode, Henry had woken early as usual. He remembered feeling unusually warm after taking his pills, but dismissed it. Later, as he was buttering toast, he noticed his right hand twitch slightly, spilling crumbs on the counter. A moment later, as he tried to ask Emily about her plans for the day, the words caught in his mouth and tangled into something unrecognizable. It lasted less than 2 minutes, and when it passed, he brushed it aside, telling himself it was just fatigue or perhaps the cold weather. But Emily, watching closely, had seen the flicker of fear in his eyes, the silent acknowledgement that something was very wrong. When I explained to Henry that what he experienced was most likely a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, the room grew very still. These episodes are often the body's early warning, a fleeting disruption of blood flow to the brain that can vanish as quickly as it appears, but still leave a mark. The real danger, I told him gently, is that they often precede a much larger, more devastating stroke. His brow furrowed as he sat back, his hands folding together. "But I've done everything right," he murmured almost to himself. "I eat well, I exercise, I take my vitamins." The disbelief in his voice was something I'd heard countless times before, the shock of realizing that the very habits meant to protect could, under the wrong circumstances, become a silent threat. I assured Henry that his intentions were good. He wasn't careless, he wasn't reckless, but the body at 72 is not the same as it was at 42. The way we process supplements changes, the kidneys, liver, and blood vessels all become more sensitive, less forgiving. High doses of certain vitamins, especially in combination, can quietly increase blood pressure, thin the blood too much, or stiffen delicate arteries. These shifts happen in silence, and there is rarely a moment that clearly announces the danger before it arrives. For many older adults, the warning comes in the form of a sudden dizziness, a fleeting confusion, or, as in Henry's case, a brief slip in speech. Moments easy to ignore until one day they cannot be ignored at all. Over the next hour, I walked Henry and Emily through what I suspected was happening inside his body. The calcium slowly building in his arteries from excess vitamin D, the blood-thinning effect of high-dose vitamin E on top of his aspirin, the subtle nerve irritation from too much B6, the creeping pressure in the brain from years of vitamin A, and the unpredictable swings in blood vessel dilation from niacin. None of these taken alone in moderation would necessarily be dangerous, but together and over time, they formed a perfect storm in the body of a man who had no reason to suspect danger. His head nodded slowly as the reality settled in. He wasn't unlucky, he was simply uninformed. What struck me most that day wasn't just Henry's story, but the way it mirrors so many others. Older adults, determined to remain healthy and independent, turn to what they believe are safe, natural solutions. They collect pills from health stores, online ads, and recommendations from friends, never realizing that the cumulative effect of these helpers can quietly strain the very organ they want most to protect: the brain. And because the changes happen without pain, without visible warning, they are easy to dismiss until they erupt into something irreversible. Henry agreed to a full review of his supplements, lab work to check his vitamin levels, and a plan to replace most of his pills with carefully chosen, nutrient-rich foods. It wasn't easy for him to let go of the bottles he had trusted for years. They felt like old allies. But as we talked about blueberries over breakfast, leafy greens in his salads, salmon twice a week, and a modest daily walk with Emily, I saw a shift in his expression. The fear that had tightened his face earlier was loosening, replaced by a quiet determination. "If this is what it takes to stay here for my grandkids," he said softly, "then that's what I'll do." That day in my office was a turning point for Henry, not just in his health, but in the way he understood it. The illusion that protection comes from more pills had cracked, revealing something both simpler and more powerful. The idea that the path to a strong, steady mind lies not in a cabinet full of capsules, but in the awareness of what truly helps and what quietly harms. And it was clear to me that Henry's journey, the fears, the lessons, the choices, would become a message worth sharing with every older adult who believes they are doing everything right, but might, without knowing it, be walking closer to danger with each passing day. The first time Henry truly felt fear for his own mind, it was a crisp autumn morning in late October. The kind of day he usually loved, golden light streaming through the kitchen window, the maple trees outside blazing with color, and the smell of coffee drifting across the room. But as he sat down with his toast and Emily chatted about her plans for the weekend, something in his body seemed to shift, like a shadow moving across his thoughts. He reached for his mug and noticed his hand trembling slightly, a small, almost imperceptible quiver. At first, he smiled faintly, brushing it off. But when he tried to reply to Emily's question, the words tangled and slipped, his tongue heavy in his mouth, the sentence crumbling before it could escape. Emily's cheerful expression dissolved instantly. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Henry blinked, confused. He could hear her clearly, but he couldn't seem to answer. The room felt strangely far away, the edges of his vision tightening. It lasted less than a minute, maybe two, but when his words finally stumbled out, they sounded as if they belonged to someone else. The look in Emily's eyes told him she was more frightened than she wanted him to know. She reached for her phone, ready to call for help, but Henry shook his head, insisting it was nothing. "Just tired," he managed to say, trying to make it sound light. But deep inside, Henry knew this wasn't nothing. For as long as he could remember, his mind had been his anchor. He could recall the exact dates of battles from the Civil War, remember the faces of students from 40 years ago, even recite whole passages from books he'd taught in his early years. The idea that his brain might falter, that his thoughts might be interrupted, scattered, though was unthinkable. Still, the stubborn part of him, the part that had weathered winters in Vermont and raised 2 children on a teacher's salary, told him to wait it out to see if it happened again before making a fuss. It did happen again, though not in exactly the same way. 2 days later, as Henry was raking leaves in the yard, he felt a sudden lightheadedness, a tilt in his balance that forced him to steady himself against the handle of the rake. The sensation passed quickly, but he noticed his right leg felt heavy for the rest of the afternoon, as though it belonged to someone else. That evening, when he told Emily, she fixed him with the kind of look only a daughter can give her father, equal parts worry and frustration. "Dad, this isn't normal. We're going to see the doctor. Tomorrow." In my office the next morning, Henry sat across from me with that same faint smile, the one that tries to hide unease. He told me about the coffee incident, the brief slurring, the heaviness in his leg. He wanted me to say it was nothing serious, perhaps low blood sugar or dehydration. But as I listened, I knew we were looking at something far more dangerous. I explained gently that these episodes sounded like transient ischemic attacks, mini strokes, where blood flow to the brain is briefly interrupted. The trouble is, these are not harmless. They are warnings, and too often they are followed by a major stroke within days or weeks. Henry's eyes dropped to the floor. "I've done everything I can to stay healthy," he said quietly. "I walk every day. I eat my greens. I take my vitamins." It was the vitamins, written neatly on a folded sheet of paper in his pocket, that caught my attention. Vitamin D, vitamin E, B complex, a vision supplement with vitamin A, and a heart health formula with niacin, all taken every morning without fail. His dosages, as he explained them, were well above what most older adults need. I could already see the threads connecting his symptoms to the pills he trusted. We talked about how, as the body ages, it becomes more sensitive to excess. Too much calcium in the blood from vitamin D can stiffen arteries. Too much vitamin E can thin the blood beyond safety. High-dose B6 can irritate the nerves. Excess vitamin A can raise pressure inside the skull. Niacin can cause sudden blood vessel changes. None of this was meant to frighten him, only to make him see that his body was no longer the same as it was in his 40s. "What you're experiencing isn't bad luck," I told him softly. "It's your body's way of saying something isn't right." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a few late leaves drifted past, catching the sunlight as they fell. "I thought I was protecting myself," he said finally. "I thought more was better." His voice cracked slightly at the last word. Emily reached over and squeezed his hand. "Dad, we just want you to be here, whatever it takes." That afternoon, as he left my office with a plan for tests and a review of his supplements, Henry looked older than when he had arrived. Not weaker exactly, but as though he had glimpsed a truth he wished he could unsee. He had always believed in preparation, in fortifying himself against the unknown. But now he understood that protection wasn't just about adding things in, sometimes it was about knowing when to take things away. This was the beginning of a journey neither of us could have predicted, one that would take Henry from the comfort of long-held habits into the sometimes uncomfortable territory of change. A journey that, in the end, might save his life. The morning after our first appointment, Henry sat at his kitchen table, staring at the neat row of pill bottles in front of him. They had always felt like a badge of responsibility, a sign that he took his health seriously. Each label promised something good: stronger bones, a healthier heart, sharper memory, better eyesight. But now, after our conversation, they looked different, not as guardians, but as possible suspects. His hand hovered over the bottle of vitamin D, the one he had been most faithful to. For years, he had taken it without question, believing it was as harmless as sunshine. He could still remember the first time he bought it. It was a rainy November afternoon about 10 years ago. He'd read an article in a health magazine claiming that vitamin D deficiency was a silent epidemic among seniors. The piece had been full of alarming statistics about brittle bones and weakened immunity. When he stopped at the pharmacy that evening, he picked up a bottle without even looking too closely at the dosage. 10,000 IU capsules. High potency, the label said proudly. He figured more was better. After all, he reasoned, sunshine was free and good for you. Surely a concentrated dose of it in a pill would be even better. Over the years, taking that little soft gel had become as natural to him as brushing his teeth. He never questioned whether he actually needed so much, never thought about what might happen if his body couldn't use it all. Now, after learning how excess vitamin D could push calcium into his bloodstream, stiffen his arteries, and put pressure on his brain, he felt a quiet unease. Could this tiny pill have been part of the reason he'd felt those tremors, that strange heaviness in his leg? Emily noticed him sitting there, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" she asked, pouring herself coffee. Henry held up the bottle. "This one," he said simply. "It's supposed to help my bones, but the doc thinks it might be part of what's hurting me." Emily frowned. "I thought vitamin D was good for everyone." Henry nodded. "So did I. That's what makes this so tricky. It's not bad in itself, but too much for too long." He let the sentence trail off, unwilling to finish it aloud. Later that morning, Henry and I spoke on the phone. I explained again that vitamin D wasn't the enemy. The real danger was in the dose and timing. "Think of your arteries like garden hoses," I told him. "They need to stay flexible so blood can flow easily. Too much vitamin D causes calcium to build up in them, making them stiff, like old cracked hoses. That stiffness makes it harder for your heart to pump blood to your brain." I also reminded him that taking vitamin D at night, as he often did after forgetting it in the morning, could be especially risky. Calcium levels spike when the body should be resting, raising blood pressure in the early morning hours when most strokes happen. Henry listened quietly, occasionally murmuring, "I see," the way he used to when a student's question revealed a gap in his own explanation. He was starting to connect the dots, but the idea that something so small, so ordinary, could quietly build toward a crisis still seemed unbelievable. "So what do I do now?" he asked. I told him we'd start by testing his blood levels. If he wasn't deficient, and many people aren't, he might not need a supplement at all, or perhaps just a much smaller dose taken in the morning. That afternoon, Emily suggested they go for a walk. It was chilly but sunny, the kind of weather that used to be Henry's favorite. As they strolled past the familiar houses in their neighborhood, he thought about how much time he had spent indoors in recent years. After retiring, his days no longer revolved around commuting, playground duty, or outdoor history walks with his students. Instead, he spent more time reading inside, working on his model trains, or chatting with friends over coffee. Without realizing it, he'd slowly reduced his natural sunlight exposure, the kind that stimulates the body's own vitamin D production in a safe, regulated way. Henry paused on the sidewalk and tilted his face toward the sun, closing his eyes. The light felt warm, almost comforting. "Maybe this is what I should have been doing all along," he said. Emily smiled. "It's free, Dad, and no scary side effects." They laughed, but the truth of it stayed with him. It wasn't that supplements were bad, it was that they were never meant to replace the natural rhythms of life, the slow, steady inputs the body understands. That night, Henry placed the vitamin D bottle in the back of his cabinet. He didn't throw it away, he wasn't ready for that step, but he wanted it out of sight for now. Instead of ending the day with a high-dose capsule, he planned to start the next morning with a short walk, maybe even a trip to the park if the weather held. It was a small change, but it felt like the right one. A few days later, his lab results came back. As I suspected, his vitamin D levels were already high, more than enough for bone health, well above the range most people need. When I told him, he let out a slow breath. "So I've been giving myself too much of a good thing," he said. I nodded. "Yes, and with your arteries already showing signs of stiffness, that extra calcium isn't doing you any favors." Henry thought about his father, who had suffered a massive stroke at 75. He remembered visiting him in the rehab center, seeing the frustration in his eyes when he couldn't form the words he wanted to say. The memory had haunted him for years, driving his determination to protect his own brain. And now, standing in his kitchen with the test results in hand, he realized that the same desire to prevent illness had nearly led him into the same trap. Over the following week, Henry began to notice subtle changes. The slight morning dizziness that had crept into his routine was less frequent. His sleep felt deeper, more restful. Even his balance seemed steadier on their walks. He still had work to do. There were other supplements to examine, other habits to adjust. But this first step gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. One evening, as he and Emily prepared dinner together, she asked him how he was feeling. Henry smiled. "Like I've finally started listening to my body instead of just feeding it what I think it wants." He picked up a handful of fresh spinach and added it to the salad bowl. Turns out, sometimes the answer isn't in a bottle. Sometimes it's right here on the table. For as long as Henry could remember, his mornings had followed a comforting rhythm. He would rise early, often before the sun, shuffle into the kitchen in his worn slippers, and put the kettle on for tea or coffee. While the water heated, he would lay out his small white plate, placing his vitamins and supplements in a neat semicircle, a ritual as ingrained as tying his shoes. It was a habit built over decades, one that gave him a sense of purpose at the start of each day. But now, after our recent conversations, that simple act carried a shadow. One particular morning, just a week after he'd decided to stop his high-dose vitamin D, Henry found himself hesitating at the pill plate. His hand hovered over the next bottle, the one he had long believed was his heart's best friend, vitamin E. He'd first started taking it in his late 60s after reading that it could improve circulation, protect against heart disease, and even help memory. The label on his bottle promised maximum strength and support for cardiovascular health. It sounded harmless, even noble. But the dose printed in small numbers, 800 IU, was far higher than what most seniors need. That morning, as he sipped his tea, Henry remembered a story I had told him about another patient. She had been taking vitamin E while also prescribed a blood thinner for her heart. The combination had tipped her blood into dangerous territory, making it too thin to clot when needed. One small, fragile vessel in her brain had ruptured, and in the span of a few minutes, her life had changed forever. Henry had listened quietly then, but now, alone in his kitchen, the weight of that story pressed heavier on him. Emily joined him at the table, yawning and pulling her cardigan tight around her. "You're quiet this morning," she said. Henry pushed the vitamin E bottle slightly away from his plate. "Thinking about this one," he admitted. "It's supposed to help my heart, but I'm wondering if it might be part of the problem." Emily glanced at the label. "Dad, isn't that the one you've been taking for years?" He nodded. "Yes, every morning, like clockwork. And maybe that's the problem. I've never stopped to ask if I still need it or if it's even safe for me anymore." Later that day, Henry called me to talk about it. I explained how vitamin E works, how it can act like a natural blood thinner. In small amounts, that can be helpful, but in larger doses, especially for someone already taking aspirin like Henry, it can push the blood's clotting ability beyond safety. "Your blood vessels," I told him, "are like delicate garden hoses. A little give in the walls is fine, but if you weaken them too much, they're more likely to burst under pressure. In the brain, even a tiny bleed can cause big problems." Henry was silent for a moment. "So every morning, I've been helping my heart on one side and putting my brain at risk on the other?" I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "That's one way to put it," I replied gently. "The tricky thing is, you don't feel it happening. There's no pain, no warning. You just think you're doing the right thing until one day something gives." That evening, Emily sat with Henry in the living room as the news murmured quietly from the TV. He was turning the vitamin E bottle over in his hands, reading the fine print again. "Do you remember when Mom used to say too much of a good thing can be bad?" he asked suddenly. Emily smiled faintly. "Yes, usually about pie." Henry chuckled, but his expression soon sobered. "She was right, and I think I've been proving it every morning without even knowing it." The next morning, Henry made a change. He left the vitamin E bottle in the cabinet and instead poured himself a small dish of walnuts and sunflower seeds. They were natural sources of vitamin E, but in amounts his body could handle, without the concentrated, high-dose punch of a capsule. As he ate, he felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about removing a pill, it was about replacing it with something real, something his body recognized as food rather than an isolated chemical. Over the following days, Henry noticed something subtle. The occasional morning headache he'd been dismissing as just part of getting older began to fade. He felt a little steadier when standing up from his chair, less prone to those brief spells of lightheadedness that had sometimes made him grab for the armrest. Emily noticed too. "You seem lighter," she said one afternoon as they walked in the park, "like there's less fog around you." One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Henry told Emily he wanted to share what he'd learned with his old friend George, who also took a long list of supplements. "I think we've all fallen into the same trap," he said, slicing tomatoes. "We want to be healthy, so we grab these pills, thinking they're harmless helpers. But nobody tells us that at our age, the line between help and harm is thinner than we think." That night, as Henry sat in his favorite armchair, he realized something important. Habits feel safe not because they are, but because they're familiar. Every morning for years, his supplement routine had been as predictable as sunrise. But predictability isn't the same as wisdom. In his case, it had kept him from questioning whether what he was doing still made sense for the man he was now, a man in his 70s, with a heart that had been through decades of service, a brain that had carried him through a lifetime of memories, and blood vessels that no longer had the resilience of youth. By the end of the week, Henry had a new ritual. The pill plate was gone, replaced by a simple breakfast of oatmeal topped with berries, a handful of nuts, and a tall glass of water. It was less flashy than a rainbow of capsules, but it made him feel calmer, more in control. "Feels like I'm feeding myself," he told Emily one morning, "instead of just dosing myself." And as the days passed, he realized something even more profound. Letting go of a habit that no longer served him wasn't a loss. It was an act of care. An acknowledgement that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for your health is not to add one more thing, but to stop, to listen, and to take away what might be quietly doing harm. A week after Henry set aside his vitamin E capsules, he came back to my office for a follow-up. We went over his lab results together, and one number in particular caught my eye. His calcium levels were higher than they should be. It wasn't dangerously high yet, but for a man his age, it was enough to raise concern. Henry frowned at the paper in my hand. "But I don't drink much milk, and I've never been one for cheese," he said. That was true. His diet wasn't heavy in dairy, which meant the excess calcium was coming from somewhere else. I reminded him about his old high-dose vitamin D habit and how it encouraged calcium to move from his digestive system into his bloodstream. "Think of it like pouring more and more sand into a pipe," I explained. "It might flow through for a while, but eventually it starts to clog. And in your case, the pipes we're talking about are your blood vessels, especially the delicate ones in your brain." Henry sat back in his chair, his lips pressed together. He was a history teacher. He understood metaphors, and this one, I could see, hit home. On his walk home from the clinic that afternoon, Henry couldn't stop picturing the pipes in his head. The network of vessels winding through his brain, some already stiff from age. He imagined calcium deposits forming quietly along their walls, making the channels narrower, the blood flow less free. It reminded him of an old garden hose he'd once tried to use in early spring, only to find it brittle and cracked, the water sputtering instead of streaming. Except this time, the hose was inside him. That evening, over dinner, Henry told Emily about the test results. She listened quietly, pushing her fork across her plate. "So, the vitamin D was part of the problem?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Yes, but it's more than that. It's what it's been doing over time. It's like I've been hardening my own blood vessels without realizing it." Emily's eyes widened slightly. "And that can cause a stroke?" He hesitated, then nodded again. "Yes, especially if one of those narrowed vessels gets blocked, or if pressure builds until something bursts." The idea that damage could be building silently inside his body was unsettling. Henry had always thought danger came with warning signs, a fever before an infection, pain before an injury. But here was a threat that grew in silence, invisible until the day it made itself known in the worst possible way. That night, he lay in bed longer than usual before sleep came, turning over the same thought again and again. What else had been happening inside him without his knowledge? The next morning, instead of heading straight for the coffee pot, Henry grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The sun had just cleared the rooftops, spilling light across the frosted lawns. He walked slowly down the street, breathing in the cold air. Somewhere along the way, he stopped and tilted his head back to catch the warmth on his face. It was a small rebellion, choosing sunlight over a supplement, trusting nature to do in gentle doses what a pill had done in excess. A few days later, Henry sat in his kitchen with a small notepad listing other sources of calcium in his diet. There weren't many, but he noticed he'd been taking a daily multivitamin for years without thinking about what it contained. Out of habit, he pulled the bottle from the cabinet and scanned the label. Sure enough, calcium, right there, along with another dose of vitamin D. He shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "They sneak it in everywhere," he muttered. When I saw Henry again, we talked about how calcium works in the body, how it's essential for strong bones and proper nerve function, but only in balance. Too much in the blood, especially for older adults, can lead to calcification in places it doesn't belong. And in the brain, I told him, those deposits make the vessels less flexible. It's like replacing a stretch of soft garden hose with brittle tubing. It just can't handle pressure the same way. Henry sighed, tapping his finger lightly on the arm of his chair. "It's strange," he said. "I used to think the danger was in not getting enough of something. But maybe at my age, the danger is in getting too much." I smiled at him. "That's a wise way to put it." Over the following weeks, Henry began making small, deliberate changes. He stopped his multivitamin, choosing instead to get nutrients from fresh vegetables, nuts, and fish. He cut back on processed foods that were fortified with calcium and other minerals he didn't need in excess. And he made his morning walks a habit, not rushed, not forced, but steady and enjoyable, letting the sun do its quiet work. Emily noticed the change in his demeanor. "You seem calmer," she told him one afternoon as they strolled past the library. Henry nodded. "It's because I'm starting to understand my body again, not just what it needs, but what it doesn't." He paused, glancing at the bare branches swaying gently overhead. "It's like pruning a tree. You have to cut back the excess so the healthy parts can grow strong." One Sunday, Henry met his old friend George for coffee. They hadn't talked much since Henry's health scare, and George was curious about the changes he'd made. Henry told him about the calcium buildup, the dangers of oversupplementing, and how he was learning to trust food and sunlight more than pills. George frowned. I've been taking vitamin D for years, too. Big dose, figured it was harmless. Henry leaned forward slightly. That's exactly what I thought. But it's worth checking, George. Better to know now than to find out after it's too late. The conversation left Henry feeling strangely lighter. It wasn't just that he was protecting himself, he was passing the lesson on. The thought that George might avoid the same risks gave Henry a sense of purpose, a way to turn his own mistakes into something useful. By the end of the month, Henry's repeat blood test showed his calcium levels had dropped back into the normal range. His blood pressure was steadier, his morning fog lifting. He still had other parts of his supplement routine to examine, but for the first time in years, he felt like the ground beneath his feet was firm again. And as he stood at the window one cold morning, watching the sun rise over the rooftops, he thought to himself, sometimes the quietest changes are the ones that keep you alive. By the time Henry had lowered his calcium levels and replaced his morning vitamin D habit with gentle sunlight, he felt as if he'd cleared one major hurdle. But there was another bottle on his kitchen shelf that kept drawing his attention, the tall, amber container of vitamin E. It still sat beside the tea canister, as it had for years, like an old friend he hadn't quite decided to part with. Even though he'd stopped taking it daily, Henry hadn't thrown it away. A part of him still wrestled with the thought, could it really be as dangerous as the doctor says? He remembered how he'd started with vitamin E. It was at a neighborhood health talk held at the community center nearly a decade ago. A local wellness speaker had extolled its virtues, protection for the heart, stronger immunity, even youthful skin. Henry, never one to be careless with his health, bought a bottle the very next day. And since then, each morning he'd taken it faithfully, sometimes even doubling the dose when he felt particularly run down. It was just vitamin E after all. How could it hurt? One rainy evening, Emily sat with him at the dining table. She'd been scrolling on her tablet when she looked up and said, "Dad, did you know vitamin E can thin your blood?" Henry gave a small nod. "That's what the doctor told me," she frowned. "And you're still keeping it out like that?" Henry glanced at the bottle and sighed. "I guess I am. It's hard to let go of something you've believed in for so long." That week, during our follow-up visit, I decided to be direct. I told Henry the story of a patient named Eleanor, a woman in her 80s, sharp as a tack, who took vitamin E alongside her prescribed blood thinner. For years, nothing seemed wrong, but one winter morning, she collapsed in her kitchen. In the hospital, scans showed a bleed deep inside her brain, the kind that robs people of speech, movement, and often independence. The combination of her medication and that high-dose vitamin E made her blood too thin, I explained. Her vessels couldn't handle even a small rupture. Henry listened closely, his brows knitting together. "That could have been me," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes, especially since you take aspirin every day. The risk may be invisible now, but it's real." It's a hard truth for many older adults to accept, that the very things they've trusted to protect their health can become dangerous with age. For Henry, the realization was sobering. That night, he placed the vitamin E bottle in a box with other supplements he no longer planned to take. He sealed the box and set it in the pantry, out of sight. It wasn't just about avoiding temptation, it was about closing a chapter. But habits have a way of lingering. A few mornings later, as Henry poured his tea, his eyes drifted toward the pantry door. He wondered if stopping was truly necessary, or if he was overreacting. It's a thought I hear from patients all the time. The pull of routine, the nagging feeling that removing something might leave you unprotected. Henry poured another cup of tea and pushed the thought aside. For now, he trusted the plan. Instead of a capsule, Henry began adding a few almonds and sunflower seeds to his breakfast. These foods offered natural vitamin E in small, safe amounts, wrapped in the fiber, healthy fats, and other nutrients his body could use without risk. He discovered he actually enjoyed cracking almonds by hand, a small ritual that slowed him down in the mornings. Emily noticed the change in her father. "You seem lighter," she remarked one afternoon as they walked together. "Like you're not carrying so much worry," Henry chuckled softly. "Maybe it's because I'm not swallowing it in capsule form anymore." Still, the weight of what might have been stayed with him. One evening, while reading in his favorite armchair, he caught himself wondering, what if I hadn't had that mini-stroke warning? What if the first sign had been the real thing, the kind that leaves you unable to speak? The thought sent a shiver through him. He thought of friends who'd had strokes and never recovered their independence, whose families became caregivers overnight. And in that moment, Henry felt grateful, not just for catching it early, but for the chance to change course. At our next visit, I could see Henry's confidence growing. His blood pressure was more stable, and the light in his eyes had returned. "Feels good to know I'm not playing roulette with my brain anymore," he said with a smile. I told him that every change he'd made, however small, was stacking the odds in his favor. "It's not about avoiding every risk," I reminded him. "It's about tipping the balance towards safety." A few days later, Henry called his friend George. "You still taking that vitamin E every day?" he asked. George laughed. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" Henry took a breath and began telling him everything he'd learned about blood thinning, about the risk of bleeding in the brain, about how age changes the game. By the end of the conversation, George was quiet. "Maybe I should talk to my doctor," he said. Henry smiled. "That's all I'm saying." For Henry, sharing what he'd learned felt like lifting another weight off his shoulders. It wasn't just about protecting himself anymore, it was about looking out for the people he cared about. And perhaps in some quiet way, it was his way of making peace with the fact that he'd been on the wrong track for years without realizing it. By the end of the month, Henry no longer thought about the vitamin E bottle in his pantry. His mornings were simpler now: a glass of water, a warm breakfast, a walk in the sun. And as he moved through his day, he felt a quiet pride. He had faced a truth many people resist, that letting go of a habit, even one wrapped in years of trust, can be the very thing that saves your life. And though he would never know for certain whether that pill might have led to a brain bleed, Henry knew one thing for sure: he wasn't willing to find out the hard way. It was a cold Thursday morning when Henry found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of pill bottles spread out like cards in a poker hand. The vitamin D and vitamin E bottles were already pushed to the side, retired from his daily routine. But there was another container that caught his attention, one he had never once questioned: his small white bottle of aspirin. His cardiologist had recommended it years ago, calling it heart insurance. Henry had taken it faithfully ever since. Next to the aspirin sat the bottle of blood pressure medication his primary care doctor had prescribed after his last checkup. That combination, aspirin to keep his blood thin and the pressure-lowering pill to keep his heart from overworking, had become a quiet constant in his life. And on their own, both made sense. But as he looked at the aspirin bottle and thought about the vitamin E he'd been taking alongside it for years, a troubling picture began to form in his mind. Later that day, Henry called me. "Doc, I've been thinking," he began slowly. "You know how you said vitamin E thins the blood? Well, I've been taking aspirin every day for over a decade. That means my blood's been getting a double thinning this whole time." I could hear the unease in his voice. "Exactly," I said. "And that's why, for someone in your situation, adding high-dose vitamin E on top of aspirin can be a recipe for trouble." I told him about one of my former patients, a woman named Margaret, who had also been on a daily aspirin for her heart. She had decided on her own to start taking an over-the-counter supplement with high-dose vitamin E. For a while, she felt fine, but one morning she woke with a severe headache and blurred vision. Her husband rushed her to the hospital, where scans revealed a small but dangerous bleed in her brain. The doctors were able to stop it before it caused permanent damage, but the warning was clear. The combination of her prescribed medication and her supplement had pushed her blood past its safe limit. Henry listened quietly, the line on the phone going still. "I always thought more was better," he said finally. "Turns out I've been stacking risks without even realizing it." That night, Henry brought the conversation up with Emily. She listened, her brow furrowed. "Dad, you've been taking these things for years. Why didn't anyone tell you about this?" Henry shrugged. "Maybe they assumed I knew, or maybe they didn't think to ask about the vitamins because they're just supplements." He made a face. "They look at prescriptions. They don't always ask about the other stuff." The next morning, Henry decided to make a list, not just of his prescriptions, but of every supplement he still had in the house. As he wrote, he realized he had never once brought this full list to a doctor's appointment. He had mentioned a few things in passing, but he had never sat down and said, "Here's everything I'm taking, all together." When he came to see me the following week, Henry handed me the list. It was neatly written in his careful, looping handwriting. As I scanned it, I could see exactly where the hazards had been and where others might still be lurking. "This is perfect," I told him. "Now we can see the whole picture. That's how we catch these hidden risks." We went through each item together, crossing out the ones that no longer served him, adjusting the doses on others. Henry was surprised at how much lighter the list became. "Feels like I'm cutting clutter from my medicine cabinet," he said with a small smile, "and maybe from my brain too." In the days that followed, Henry felt an unexpected sense of relief. His mornings were simpler now. No more juggling handfuls of pills, no more wondering if he was accidentally setting himself up for harm. Instead, he focused on the essentials: his prescription medication, a balanced breakfast, a short walk in the fresh air. One afternoon, as Henry and Emily prepared lunch together, she asked, "Do you miss any of it? The old routine?" Henry thought for a moment. "Not really. At first I thought I'd feel less protected without all those pills. But now I realize I feel more in control, like I'm steering my own ship instead of just loading it with cargo and hoping it stays afloat." Still, the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't caught the problem lingered in the back of his mind. He thought about the quiet bleed in Margaret's brain, the way it had crept up without warning. He thought about how many other people his age were unknowingly stacking supplements on top of prescriptions, thinking they were doubling their protection when they were actually doubling their danger. One evening, Henry decided to call his friend George again. "Do me a favor," he said. "Next time you see your doctor, bring a list of every pill and supplement you take. Don't leave anything out. Even the stuff you think is harmless." George chuckled. "You sound like my wife now." Henry laughed softly. "Maybe, but this is one lesson I wish I'd learned sooner." By the end of the month, Henry's medicine cabinet looked nothing like it had before. It was no longer a crowded shelf of multicolored bottles, each promising to protect his health. Instead, it was a tidy row of only what was truly necessary: the medications prescribed by his doctors, a bottle of plain fish oil, and a jar of almonds on the counter. The rest was gone. And for Henry, that was more than just a change in storage. It was a change in mindset. He no longer believed that health came from piling on more and more protection. He understood now that safety meant knowing how everything he took worked together, and when less really was more. One crisp morning in early February, Henry woke before sunrise and decided to make himself a cup of tea before his walk. As he stepped into the kitchen, he felt a familiar but unwelcome sensation. That faint wobble in his legs, as if the floor beneath him had shifted just enough to throw him off balance. It wasn't enough to send him stumbling, but it was there, like a quiet reminder that something inside him wasn't quite right. He poured the hot water, trying to ignore it, but as he reached for a spoon, his hand brushed against a small, dark blue bottle at the back of the shelf. "Nerve support formula," the label read in bold gold letters. He hadn't taken it in a few weeks, not since he'd started simplifying his supplement routine, but the sight of it brought back a wave of memory. For years, he had taken 2 tablets every morning, convinced it was his shield against numbness, tingling, and the slow loss of coordination he'd seen in some of his older friends. The main ingredient was vitamin B6, listed proudly on the front as high potency, 100 milligrams per tablet. Back when Henry first bought it, he hadn't thought twice about the dose. The man behind the health store counter had told him it was great for nerve health, especially for seniors. And Henry, eager to protect his balance and prevent the kind of slow decline that traps people indoors, had started taking it daily, sometimes twice daily if he felt especially tired. It wasn't until our earlier conversations about supplements that I asked him specifically about his nerve formula. When he told me the dose, I remember leaning back in my chair and saying gently, "That's far more than your body needs, and over time, it could be making your nerve problems worse, not better." He looked at me, then like I had spoken another language. "But it's for nerves," he'd said. I nodded. "Yes, in the right amount, but too much vitamin B6 can actually damage the protective covering around your nerves. Just like stripping insulation off a wire, the signals don't travel properly anymore. That can lead to numbness, weakness, and balance problems. Exactly the things you're trying to prevent." The memory of that conversation came back to Henry now as he stood in his kitchen. He thought about the times he'd stumbled for no reason, the occasional pins and needles sensation in his feet that he'd chalked up to just getting older. Maybe it wasn't just age. Maybe in trying to protect himself, he had been slowly setting himself up for the very thing he feared. Later that day, Henry called me. "Doc," he said, "I think I understand now why you told me to stop that nerve formula. I've been paying more attention since I stopped, and I think I'm steadier. It's not perfect, but I'm not getting that weird sway as often in the mornings. I told him that was exactly the kind of improvement we hope to see when we remove the excess. The body can heal, I said, but it needs time, and it needs us to stop giving it more than it can handle. That evening, Henry brought the bottle of nerve formula into the living room and set it on the coffee table. Emily glanced at it and raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" she asked. Henry sat down beside her. "The culprit," he said simply. He explained how too much vitamin B6 can harm nerves instead of helping them, and how he'd been taking well over 6 times the recommended amount for years. Emily looked at him in disbelief. "Why didn't anyone tell you this before?" Henry gave a small, sad smile. "I suppose nobody asked how much I was taking, and I never thought to question it." Over the next week, Henry paid close attention to how his body felt. On his walks, he noticed that his steps felt a little more grounded, his feet finding the pavement with more certainty. In the evenings, when he stood up from his chair, he felt less of that momentary wobble that had once made him grip the armrest. He knew it might take months for the nerves to recover fully, if they could at all, but the change gave him hope. One afternoon, while visiting his old friend George, Henry brought up the subject. "You ever take one of those nerve health supplements?" he asked casually. George nodded. "Sure. Got one right now in my kitchen. Big yellow label. Says it's good for energy and circulation." Henry asked him to check the dosage, and when George read it aloud, vitamin B6, 100 milligrams, Henry felt a sinking familiarity. "That's the same one I was taking," he told George, "and I think it was making my balance worse. Might be worth talking to your doctor about." George frowned, clearly uneasy. "I thought it was helping me." Henry nodded. "So did I." By the end of the month, the nerve formula was gone from Henry's kitchen. He replaced it with real foods that offered gentle, balanced amounts of B6: bananas, spinach, chicken, and sunflower seeds. Instead of chasing a high-potency promise, he was learning to trust the quiet power of moderation. And as he sat at his kitchen table one bright morning, sipping tea and looking out at the snow-dusted street, Henry felt something shift inside him. He realized that protecting himself wasn't about building a wall of pills. It was about removing the ones that quietly weakened the foundation. The next time we spoke, Henry told me something that stayed with me. "I used to think the trick to staying healthy was to outsmart aging, to get ahead of it with more vitamins, more supplements, more of everything. But I see now that the trick is listening, really listening, because the body tells you when something's not right. I just wasn't listening before." And in that moment, I could hear it, not just in his words, but in the steadiness of his voice. Henry was finding his balance again, in more ways than one. It was a chilly evening in late winter when Henry found himself gripping the edge of the bathroom sink, his breath coming in short gasps. Earlier that day, he had slipped on a patch of ice outside the grocery store, his right leg twisting awkwardly beneath him before he hit the pavement with a dull thud. Fortunately, the fall hadn't caused any broken bones, but the shock of it lingered. As he steadied himself now, looking into the mirror, he noticed the faint tremor in his hand, the same one that had first worried Emily months ago, and the slight weakness in his legs that seemed to come and go without warning. The fall wasn't his first, but it was different. It was the kind of stumble that whispers of vulnerability rather than mere clumsiness. Henry remembered the other times he'd lost his balance, a missed step on the porch, a wobble while reaching for a book on the top shelf. At first he'd brushed them off as just getting older, but now, with everything he'd learned about his supplement routine and its hidden dangers, those moments took on a new meaning. They were signals, warnings that his body was struggling beneath the surface. That night, Henry sat quietly in the living room, Emily by his side. He recounted the fall, the sharp jolt of fear as he hit the cold ground, and the ache that followed. Emily listened intently, her eyes filled with concern. "Dad," she said softly, "maybe it's time to get a walker. You don't have to do this alone." Henry smiled faintly but shook his head. "I'm not ready for that yet. I want to get stronger, steadier first." We talked about those falls during his next visit. I reminded Henry that falls are often more than accidents. They're the body's way of telling us something is off. Nerve damage, muscle weakness, poor balance, all could be tied to the excess supplements he had taken for years. Vitamin B6 toxicity, in particular, could cause numbness and muscle weakness, making falls more likely and recovery more difficult. Henry was quiet, absorbing the weight of it. "So those little stumbles weren't just bad luck, they were my nerves breaking down?" he asked. I nodded. Exactly. And the longer the damage goes unchecked, the higher the risk of serious injury. But the good news is that stopping the toxic supplements and focusing on balanced nutrition and gentle exercise can help your body heal. That evening, Henry made a decision. He would start physical therapy, something he had avoided because it felt like admitting weakness. But with Emily's encouragement, he made an appointment and began simple exercises designed to strengthen his legs and improve his balance. The early sessions were challenging. His muscles ached, and frustration crept in when progress seemed slow. But he persevered, motivated by the thought of walking safely to the park with Emily, of being there for his grandchildren without fear. As weeks passed, Henry noticed changes. He felt steadier on his feet, the tremors less frequent, the numbness in his toes fading. His confidence grew, and with it, his willingness to talk openly about the risks he had unknowingly taken. One afternoon, as he and Emily walked along a familiar trail, he said, "I used to think falling was just part of getting old. Now I know it's a message, one I almost ignored." Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you listened." Henry's journey through those falls became a turning point, not just physically, but emotionally. He began sharing his story with friends and community groups, warning others about the hidden dangers of unchecked supplements. His message was clear. Aging doesn't have to mean surrender, but it requires awareness and respect for the body's changing needs. One evening, as Henry sat by the fireplace, he reflected on how close he had come to a life altered by injury or worse. He thought about Eleanor, the patient who had suffered a brain bleed, and Margaret, who'd collapsed unexpectedly. He thought about the countless seniors who trusted their pills without question, unaware of the risks lurking in their cabinets. Henry knew he was lucky to have caught the warning signs, to have support, and to have the chance to change course. But luck wasn't enough. What saved him was knowledge, courage, and the willingness to listen to his body, his doctors, and his loved ones. As the fire crackled softly beside him, Henry whispered a quiet promise to himself: to keep learning, to keep listening, and to keep walking steadily into each new day, one sure step at a time. A few weeks after starting physical therapy, Henry noticed something else troubling. His vision was becoming blurry at times, especially in the mornings. At first, he thought it was just tiredness or the winter gloom playing tricks on his eyes. But one day, as he tried to read a letter from his insurance company, the words danced and doubled, making the simple task frustrating. He blinked hard and rubbed his eyes, hoping the fog would lift. When it didn't, he decided it was time to mention it to his eye doctor. During his appointment, the ophthalmologist listened carefully as Henry described his symptoms. After a thorough exam, the doctor's face grew serious. "Henry, you have something called increased intracranial pressure," she explained gently. "It means there's extra pressure inside your skull, pushing against your brain and eyes. It's sometimes called pseudotumor cerebri, or false brain tumor, because it mimics symptoms of a brain tumor, but without an actual mass." Henry's heart sank. "What could cause this?" he asked. The doctor looked at his medication list. One common cause in older adults can be excess vitamin A intake. Vitamin A is fat-soluble, meaning it builds up in your body over time rather than being flushed out like some other vitamins. Henry sat in stunned silence. He recalled the bottle of vitamin A supplements he'd been taking for years, a vision support formula he'd believed was helping keep his eyesight sharp. The label boasted of improving night vision and protecting against age-related decline. He'd never imagined it could cause harm. I remember when Henry first told me about this. I explained how vitamin A accumulates in the liver and tissues, and over time, excess amounts can increase pressure inside the skull, leading to headaches, vision problems, dizziness, and even permanent damage if untreated. The problem was that many multivitamins and supplements marketed for eye health contained doses far exceeding what older adults truly need. Henry's story reminded me of Ms. Lillian, a retired piano teacher who had suffered a similar fate. For years, she had faithfully taken high-dose vitamin A supplements, believing they protected her eyesight. Eventually, she began experiencing debilitating headaches and blurred vision that progressed to difficulty balancing and speaking clearly. The diagnosis of elevated intracranial pressure was a shock, and though she received treatment to lower the pressure, her recovery was slow and uncertain. For Henry, the diagnosis was a wake-up call. He stopped taking the vitamin A immediately and focused on natural sources of eye-friendly nutrients like leafy greens, carrots, and berries. We arranged for regular eye exams to monitor his condition and started treatments to reduce the pressure safely. It wasn't easy for Henry to accept that something meant to protect him was instead threatening his future. But as days passed, he began to understand the delicate balance his body required, how too much of a good thing can tip the scales into danger, especially as we age. Emily supported him through this new challenge, accompanying him to appointments and encouraging him to stick with the treatment plan. She also helped him adjust his diet, introducing recipes rich in antioxidants and vitamins that support eye health without risking overload. Henry learned to listen to his body's signals more than ever before. The headaches, the blurriness, the dizziness, they were warnings, not nuisances to be ignored. He realized that trusting supplements blindly was no longer an option. Instead, a mindful approach was needed. Careful monitoring, consultation with doctors, and a focus on whole foods. One morning, as Henry gazed out at the sunrise filtering through his kitchen window, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Protecting his vision wasn't about chasing quick fixes in a bottle. It was about nurturing his whole body with patience and care. He shared his experience with friends at his local senior center, urging them to be cautious with supplements, especially those promising miraculous benefits for eyes and brain. "We want to stay sharp and independent," he told them, "but that means being informed, not just hopeful." Henry's journey through blurred vision became another turning point, a reminder that health is fragile and complex, and that sometimes the safest path forward is the simplest: real food, trusted advice, and listening closely to what the body needs. After Henry's diagnosis of elevated intracranial pressure, the gravity of his condition settled over him like a dense fog. The term itself, pressure inside the skull, sounded both clinical and terrifying, as if his brain were trapped in a tight cage slowly squeezing it. But Henry was determined not to let fear take hold. Instead, he chose to face this new chapter with the same quiet courage that had carried him through his earlier health battles. In the days following the diagnosis, Henry adhered closely to the treatment plan we designed together. This included medications to help reduce the pressure, routine monitoring through eye exams and imaging, and crucially, lifestyle changes that could ease the strain on his body. One of the hardest lessons he learned was to slow down, to respect his body's limits rather than push against them. There were mornings when the headaches hit hard, dull, and throbbing at the base of his skull, sometimes accompanied by nausea or a dizzy haze that blurred his vision. On those days, Henry rested, lying down in a darkened room, letting the quiet envelop him. Emily often sat nearby, reading aloud or simply offering a steady presence. Those moments, though difficult, became times of reflection and gratitude. Henry's journey was not just physical, but deeply emotional. He grappled with the frustration of dependency, the need to ask for help, to accept that some days would be slower than others. Yet he also discovered resilience in small victories: a morning with a lighter headache, an afternoon walk with steadier steps, a clear evening spent reading without discomfort. Through it all, Henry became more attuned to his body's messages. He noticed how certain foods seemed to ease the pressure: a fresh salad with leafy greens, a handful of walnuts, a glass of water infused with lemon. Conversely, he learned to avoid excess salt and processed foods that could exacerbate fluid retention and raise blood pressure. His diet evolved into a mindful practice, one that nourished not just his brain, but his whole self. Cooking became a form of therapy, blending flavors and colors that brightened his table and his mood. Emily joined him often in the kitchen, and together they experimented with recipes that supported health without sacrificing taste. Henry also found comfort in community. At the senior center, he began attending a gentle yoga class focused on balance and relaxation. The slow movements and deep breathing helped reduce tension and foster a sense of calm. He connected with others facing similar challenges, sharing stories, fears, and hopes. These connections reminded him he was not alone in his struggles. Despite the challenges, Henry's outlook grew more hopeful. He realized that elevated intracranial pressure, while serious, was manageable with the right care and attention. His doctors worked closely with him, adjusting treatments as needed and celebrating improvements, no matter how small. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry sat on his porch with Emily, watching the sky change from gold to deep indigo. He took a deep breath and said, "You know, I used to think strength meant never showing weakness, but now I see it's about knowing when to slow down, to listen, and to take care." Emily smiled warmly. "You're stronger than you know, Dad. That strength was born from experience, a journey marked by setbacks and breakthroughs, fear and courage, loss and rediscovery." Henry's path through rising pressure inside his skull taught him that health is not a destination, but a continuous dance with change. As he looked forward, Henry resolved to keep moving gently forward, embracing each day with gratitude and care. His journey was far from over, but with each step, he felt more grounded, more in tune with the rhythms of his body and life. And in that harmony, he found a new kind of peace. After months of adjusting his supplements and medications, Henry began to feel more in control of his health. But there was still one bottle that lingered in his thoughts, the heart health formula he'd taken faithfully for years. It promised to lower cholesterol, support circulation, and protect the heart. A trifecta that sounded like a perfect shield for a man his age. But as Henry learned, not all vitamins are as harmless as they seem, especially when taken in high doses without proper guidance. One afternoon, while reviewing his medications during a visit, I noticed the bottle on his list contained a high amount of niacin, also known as vitamin B3. Niacin is often praised for its ability to lower bad cholesterol, and many seniors take it to support their heart. But the doses in some over-the-counter supplements can be shockingly high. I explained to Henry that excessive niacin can cause sudden changes in blood pressure and strain the blood vessels, sometimes triggering dangerous spasms in the brain. Henry was taken aback. "So this vitamin I thought was protecting my heart might have been hurting it instead?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes, especially if taken in large amounts or combined with other medications. It's a hidden risk many don't know about." He recalled mornings when, after taking his heart formula, he would feel flushing in his face, warmth spreading across his chest, and brief waves of dizziness. At the time, he'd thought it was just a harmless side effect or maybe even a sign the vitamin was working. But now he understood those symptoms were warnings, his blood vessels dilating rapidly and then constricting, putting stress on his heart and brain. I shared the story of a patient named Dennis who experienced transient ischemic attacks or mini strokes linked to high-dose niacin supplements. Dennis had ignored the flushing and dizziness, assuming they were normal. When his symptoms worsened, he was rushed to the hospital. Fortunately, he recovered with treatment and lifestyle changes, but the experience was a stark reminder of how something seemingly benign could turn dangerous. Henry listened carefully, realizing how close he might have come to serious harm. He decided to stop taking the heart formula immediately, opting instead for lifestyle changes and medications prescribed and monitored by his doctors. He began incorporating foods known to support heart health naturally: fatty fish, rich in omega-3s, leafy greens, nuts, and whole grains. He also committed to regular, moderate exercise like walking and gentle stretching, which improved his circulation and lowered his blood pressure. Emily noticed the change in his energy and mood. "You seem lighter, Dad," she said one evening, "like a weight's been lifted." Henry smiled. "Maybe because I'm finally trusting my body instead of just a pill bottle." Henry's story about the heart vitamin became a powerful lesson he shared with friends and family, warning them to be cautious with supplements promising quick fixes for complex problems. He emphasized the importance of consulting healthcare professionals before adding any new vitamins or herbs, especially when managing chronic conditions. That year, Henry attended a community health seminar and spoke openly about his journey. He told others about the dangers of high-dose niacin and how small changes, cutting back on supplements, focusing on real food, staying active, made a big difference. His honesty resonated deeply with many seniors who had also fallen into the trap of trusting supplements without full knowledge. One chilly morning, Henry sat with Emily, watching the snow fall softly outside. He reflected on how far he'd come, from blindly taking vitamins to carefully choosing what truly supported his health. He realized the heart isn't just about blood flow or cholesterol numbers, it's about balance, awareness, and listening to your body's subtle signals. He looked forward with cautious optimism, knowing that his journey was ongoing, but he was no longer afraid. He had learned to question, to adapt, and to care for himself in ways that no pill could replace. It was during one of Henry's quiet evenings at home that the unsettling symptoms began again. Flushing waves spreading across his face, sudden dizziness that would come and go without warning. At first, he thought it was just stress, or maybe the after effects of the cold winter air sneaking into his lungs during his walks. But these episodes became more frequent and more intense, leaving him clutching the armrest of his favorite chair, trying to steady himself as the room spun slightly out of focus. Emily noticed the changes too. "Dad, you're looking pale and shaky," she said one night, guiding him gently to sit down. Henry nodded, struggling to explain the strange sensations. "It's like my head's too full and my heart's racing, but I can't catch my breath." The worry in her voice cut through the haze of his confusion and made him realize this wasn't something he could ignore. That very night, after a particularly bad spell of dizziness and slurred speech that lasted only minutes but left Henry exhausted and frightened, Emily insisted they call for medical help. At the emergency room, doctors ran a series of tests, including brain scans, and confirmed what I had feared: a transient ischemic attack, or TIA, often called a mini-stroke. Henry lay in the hospital bed, the sterile white walls closing in around him as the reality of the diagnosis sank in. The doctors explained that a TIA occurs when blood flow to a part of the brain is temporarily blocked, causing stroke-like symptoms that usually resolve within 24 hours. However, TIAs are serious warnings, ominous signals that a full-blown stroke could follow if risk factors aren't addressed. During rounds, the neurologist reviewed Henry's medications and supplement history. The pieces fell into place. The high-dose niacin he'd taken for his heart, combined with other blood-thinning agents, had caused unpredictable fluctuations in his blood pressure and circulation, creating the perfect storm for a TIA. It was a sobering realization that the vitamins meant to protect him had played a part in this near disaster. Henry's recovery was swift, but the emotional impact lingered. He grappled with feelings of vulnerability and frustration. "How could I have been so blind?" he asked me during a follow-up visit. "I thought I was doing everything to protect myself, but I was walking on a tightrope without even knowing it." I reassured him that the important thing was what he did next. Together, we adjusted his medications, eliminated risky supplements, and crafted a personalized plan focusing on heart and brain health through natural means: balanced nutrition, consistent exercise, stress management, and regular monitoring. Henry took his recovery seriously. He joined a gentle Tai Chi class to improve balance and circulation, learned meditation techniques to calm his mind, and embraced a Mediterranean-style diet rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and healthy fats. The new regimen wasn't easy, but each small victory fueled his determination. Emily became his steadfast partner, encouraging him on difficult days and celebrating improvements no matter how slight. "You're stronger than you think, Dad," she often reminded him, her voice full of hope. Months later, Henry spoke at a local health fair, sharing his story with others. He emphasized the importance of awareness and caution when it comes to supplements, especially in older adults. "Not all vitamins are harmless," he said. "Sometimes, the very things we believe are helping us can be quietly harming our brains and hearts." His message resonated with many, sparking conversations and inspiring others to reevaluate their health routines. Henry found purpose in turning his near tragedy into a lesson of caution and care, reminding everyone that knowledge is the most powerful medicine. As he continued his journey, Henry understood that his body was no longer a machine to be tuned with pills, but a living, changing system that required patience, respect, and attentive listening. And with that understanding came a new kind of strength, the strength to heal, to adapt, and to live fully despite challenges. After the scare of his transient ischemic attack, Henry felt an urgent need to rethink everything he thought he knew about health. The pills and supplements that had once lined his kitchen shelf, promising protection and vitality, now seemed like possible culprits in his near disaster. But what else could he do? How could he protect his aging body without relying on those bottles? One afternoon, Henry sat down with Emily at the kitchen table, a stack of cookbooks between them and a notebook ready for ideas. They decided to focus on food, not as a side note, but as the centerpiece of his healing journey. Emily, always the researcher, had gathered articles and recipes rich in nutrients known to support brain and heart health naturally. Henry felt a mix of hope and skepticism. Could food really do what vitamins couldn't? Their first step was simple. Henry would start eating more real, whole foods, fresh vegetables, fruits, nuts, whole grains, and fish. They planned meals together that looked as colorful as they were nourishing. Spinach, kale, and broccoli became regulars on his plate, bringing folate and antioxidants. Fatty fish like salmon and mackerel offered heart-friendly omega-3s. Berries introduced polyphenols to protect brain cells. And nuts and seeds provided vitamin E and magnesium, all in natural, balanced forms. Henry began to notice the difference almost immediately. Mornings felt clearer, energy more sustained throughout the day. Meals were not just fuel, but moments of comfort and connection, a chance to savor flavors and textures that no pill could replicate. He found joy in preparing dishes with Emily, experimenting with herbs and spices that added both taste and health benefits. One evening, as they shared a dinner of grilled salmon, quinoa, and steamed kale, Henry reflected on how far he'd come. "I used to think health was about fixing problems with pills," he said quietly. "Now I see it's about feeding my body what it truly needs to thrive." Emily smiled. "And you're doing it beautifully." His doctor reinforced this approach, emphasizing that nutrients and whole foods are absorbed more effectively and gently by the body than isolated supplements. This meant fewer risks of toxicity or dangerous interactions. It was a return to basics that suited Henry's growing wisdom and cautious heart. Henry's renewed diet also helped him shed a few pounds, lowering his blood pressure and improving his circulation. He felt more agile on his walks and steadier on his feet, small victories that bolstered his confidence. The mental fog lifted further, and he began reading and playing piano with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. At community gatherings, Henry shared his culinary discoveries with fellow seniors. He spoke not of diets or restrictions, but of nourishing the body with care and pleasure. His message was hopeful, that healing could come from the earth's bounty, not just from bottles on a shelf. One day, Henry prepared a special meal for his grandchildren, teaching them how to make berry parfaits layered with Greek yogurt and nuts. Watching their eyes light up with each bite, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about his health anymore, it was about passing on a legacy of mindful eating and self-care. In this chapter of his life, Henry realized that the food on his plate was more than sustenance. It was medicine, comfort, and joy intertwined. It was a reminder that nature's gifts, in their unprocessed and balanced form, held power far beyond what any supplement could promise. And as Henry sat back in his chair after a hearty meal, he thought about how the journey from pills to plants had brought him not just physical healing, but peace. A peace rooted in respect for his body's true needs and a deepened connection to life itself. Henry's journey had been long and winding, marked by realizations that challenged everything he once believed about health and aging. The kitchen cabinet that had once overflowed with colorful bottles and promises now looked markedly different, streamlined, simple, intentional. Each item inside had earned its place through careful thought and guidance, not impulse or fear. One chilly morning, as the first snowflakes began to drift softly outside, Henry stood before that cabinet with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The clutter and confusion of before had given way to clarity. He ran his fingers along the neat rows of what remained, his prescribed medications, a small jar of fish oil capsules, a bottle of plain vitamin B complex within safe doses, and some natural herbal teas he'd come to enjoy. There were no longer any megadoses, no questionable miracle pills claiming to fix everything at once. Emily joined him in the kitchen, her eyes bright with encouragement. "You've come so far, Dad," she said, smiling. Henry nodded, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. "It's like I'm finally taking care of myself the way I should have all along." He thought back to the early days of his health journey, the days filled with confusion, fear, and that persistent hope that more supplements meant better protection. He remembered the trembling hands, the blurred vision, the frightening episodes that nearly cost him his independence. But more than anything, he recalled the lessons learned, that health is not a commodity to be bought in bulk, but a delicate balance to be respected. The decision to clear his cabinet wasn't just about removing pills, it was about reclaiming control. Henry began sharing his experience with others in his community, often leading informal talks at the senior center where he emphasized the importance of consulting healthcare professionals before starting any supplement. His story was a beacon for those who, like him, had been caught in the maze of marketing claims and self-prescribed regimens. One afternoon, a friend approached Henry after a talk, gratitude evident in her eyes. "Your story saved me," she said softly. "I was about to start a high-dose vitamin regimen without talking to my doctor. Now I know to be careful." Henry smiled humbly, feeling a deep sense of purpose. He realized that by clearing his own cabinet, he was helping clear the path for others. The shift in Henry's mindset also transformed his daily habits. Mornings began with a glass of water and a hearty breakfast rich in natural foods rather than a handful of pills. His walks became moments of mindfulness, appreciating the crisp air and the simple pleasure of movement. Evenings were spent in quiet reflection, journaling his progress and setting gentle goals for the days ahead. At his next medical checkup, Henry's doctors were pleased with his progress. His blood pressure was stable, his neurological exams showed no new deficits, and his overall energy had improved. "You've done well," his physician said, "and it shows in your results." Henry felt a surge of pride, but also gratitude. Gratitude for the support of his family, his medical team, and the wisdom to listen when his body spoke. Looking back, Henry understood that clearing his cabinet had done more than reduce physical risks. It had saved his life in a very real sense. Not just from stroke or nerve damage, but from the overwhelming anxiety that comes with uncertainty and conflicting information. He had found peace in simplicity, trust in his body's signals, and strength in informed choices. One evening, as he and Emily prepared a simple meal together, Henry shared a thought that had settled in his heart. "I used to think living well meant adding everything I could find to my routine. Now I know it means knowing what to leave out." Emily smiled, her eyes shining. "That's wisdom, Dad." As the snow fell gently outside, Henry felt a warmth that no pill could provide, the warmth of hope, resilience, and a life reclaimed. His cabinet was clear, his path forward steady, and his story ready to inspire others to take control of their own health journeys. The final chapter of Henry's journey was not marked by a grand event or dramatic cure, but by a quiet awakening, a deep and lasting awareness that became his most powerful medicine. After months of learning, unlearning, and relearning, Henry understood that the key to a long and healthy life wasn't in chasing the latest supplements or trends, but in truly listening to his body, to his doctors, and to the wisdom of experience. One crisp morning, as Henry sat on his porch sipping tea and watching the world wake up, he reflected on everything he'd been through. The tremors, the blurred vision, the dizzy spells, the scare of a mini-stroke. It all seemed like a distant memory now, yet the lessons remained vivid. He thought about the countless seniors he had met along the way, many still caught in the cycle of blindly trusting pills and promises, unaware of the hidden dangers. Henry realized that awareness was a form of empowerment. It gave him the ability to question, to seek advice, and to make choices grounded not in fear or habit, but in knowledge and care. He knew now that every supplement, every medication, every bite of food had to be considered in the context of his whole body and life. This awareness was also a shield against the noise of misinformation that surrounded so many. The market was flooded with miracle cures and quick fixes, often promising the impossible. But Henry had learned to look past the hype and focus on what science and his doctors recommended. He had learned to be patient, to embrace small, sustainable changes rather than dramatic overhauls. One day, at the senior center, Henry was invited to speak to a group about his experience. Standing before a room filled with attentive faces, he shared not just the details of his health journey, but the philosophy that had guided him through. "The best medicine isn't always found in a bottle," he told them. "It's found in awareness, being present with your body, asking questions, and making informed decisions." His words resonated deeply. Many in the audience nodded, some with tears in their eyes, recognizing their own struggles in Henry's story. After the talk, several came up to thank him, sharing their own experiences and expressing hope that they too could find the courage to take control of their health. Henry also encouraged family members to be involved in their loved ones' care. He knew firsthand how Emily's support had been crucial, not just in managing medications, but in providing emotional strength and accountability. He urged others to talk openly about health, to share concerns, and to work together to navigate the complexities of aging. At home, Henry kept a journal where he recorded his thoughts, symptoms, and questions for doctors. This practice helped him stay engaged and proactive. It reminded him that health was not a passive state, but an ongoing journey requiring attention and effort. The quiet power of awareness also changed how Henry viewed setbacks. Instead of frustration or fear, he learned to see them as signals to slow down, reassess, and adjust. This mindset brought peace during difficult days and renewed motivation to keep moving forward. Looking ahead, Henry felt hopeful. He knew challenges would come, but he felt prepared, not just with medications or supplements, but with the wisdom to listen and the courage to act. His experience had transformed him from a passive patient into an active partner in his own care. As the sun set on another day, Henry sat in his favorite chair, feeling gratitude for the journey he had traveled. He thought of the countless others who might still be walking the path he had once been on, confused, fearful, and overwhelmed. He hoped his story would serve as a beacon, a reminder that the strongest medicine often comes from within. With a gentle smile, Henry whispered to himself, "Awareness is the gift that keeps giving." And with that, he closed his eyes, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow would bring, with clarity, strength, and peace. Henry's journey reminds us that health isn't just about the pills we take or the supplements we trust. It's about truly listening to our bodies and making thoughtful choices. From the early signs of tremors and blurred vision to the wake-up call of a mini-stroke, Henry faced the hidden dangers that too many seniors unknowingly encounter. But through courage, patience, and the support of his loved ones and doctors, he began to unravel the truth behind his symptoms. He learned that more isn't always better, especially when it comes to vitamins and medications. By clearing the clutter from his medicine cabinet, embracing natural, nourishing foods, and slowing down to honor his body's needs, Henry reclaimed control over his health and his life. His story is not just one of medical recovery, but of deep personal transformation, shifting from fear and confusion to awareness and empowerment. This journey teaches us all that it's never too late to change course, that the strongest medicine we have is the awareness to ask questions, to seek guidance, and to care for ourselves with kindness and respect. So today, if you see yourself in Henry's story, if you've ever wondered whether your health routine is truly helping or quietly harming, take a moment to listen. Look closely at what you're putting into your body. Talk to your doctors and loved ones, because the path to a healthier, fuller life begins with awareness and the courage to act on it. Your health, your future, and your independence are worth protecting. Start today.